everybody who are here in the council chamber and also the folks watching us on YouTube. And we're here tonight to hear the results of the survey that Wendy Moeller from Compass Point Planning has done for us. Wendy is undergoing a study of our zoning codes and recommending some revisions that need to be made. Just give you the backstory of why the city hired Wendy. Since we've been in office, particularly our zoning and building code administrator has come to me and said, look, we have too many gray areas in our zoning code. That it's tough to make decisions. There's too many cases that are going to the Board of Zoning Appeals, and the code confuses the board. So I felt it was time that we do a revision of our zoning code. It hasn't been revised since 1987. So property uses have changed a lot since then. So to me, it was time to undergo a study and a revision of our zoning code. So I took the idea to our planning commission. They agreed to that, and then they interviewed some companies that specialized in zoning revisions and selected Wendy and Compass Point Planning to do this study for us and make the recommendations. So that's the reason why we're here tonight. This is the first of many public meetings that we'll have during this year-long process. And so I encourage all of you to attend as many as you can. Your input is very valuable in this whole process. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Wendy.
Thank you. And I'm going to stand behind the podium so that I can operate the, well, I get to speak. So as a little bit more introduction, so my name is Wendy Moeller from Compass Point Planning out of Cincinnati. I'm a community planner by training. I've been doing this now for 26, 27 years, working with communities like New Philadelphia, across Ohio, across the Midwest. I really enjoy what I do. And my specialty is comprehensive plans and land use regulations for communities and working through those issues. As part of the team, I am working with another consultant, MS Consultants out of Columbus. Shannon Fergus is actually online watching and taking notes for me as well. But they're going to be bringing their kind of thoughts on economic development, some of their design elements to this project as well, to help with some of those concepts that we'll talk about. As the mayor pointed out, actually tonight we're going to be talking more about some recommendations for moving forward, as well as some of the survey stuff. So, what the idea behind this meeting was, before we actually put, well, I guess it's fingers to the computer anymore instead of paper to pen, and writing the actual, I'm sorry to say, boring ordinance language. We wanted to give more of a narrative of the big picture changes and themes so that we get some general buy-in before moving forward with any of these major changes. So that's what I want to talk about tonight. So as the mayor had mentioned, the whole purpose of this is to update the city's planning and zoning code. The focus of that is the zoning ordinance and the zoning map, and if any of you want to look at the map later, it is behind you, which kind of gets into how you can use land, what kind of buildings you can build, any design elements, buffering, signs, and the like. And the subdivision regulations, which are literally how do we subdivide land and how do we put in public improvements for the development. So we are looking at that entirely, and I'll talk a little bit later about how we're pulling in some other ordinances that are not currently found in the Planning and Zoning Code, but more that have a better fit in the Planning and Zoning Code. So the process is kind of this. We've already, Shannon and I have already been up here and met with the boards, had a lot of discussions with staff about, hey, what are some of the kind of day-to-day issues you're running into? We did the survey, which I didn't check what the update was, but we'll get ready to summarize that in more detail. I do have some kind of idea. I want to show you some of the results so far to see, what people think about some general development concepts, to see if people who have had interactions with the zoning, what are some of their concerns, and to see what ideas people would have when they think about the future of New Philadelphia. So we did all of that, which led to this code evaluation or code audit. And again, this is the high level. We're not getting into the details of what is permitted in exactly which district. We talk about things a little bit more generally. But it gives people a kind of a preemptive idea of what we're looking to do. After this, it's a matter of writing it, and we will be working with a kind of a small committee to go through those essentially line by line of the updated ordinance. It will be annotated to tell you, where did this language come from? Is it new to New Philadelphia? And to be honest, there's a lot of things that you are missing that are found in modern codes that we will be like, this is an entirely new section for you to consider. And again, posting this, once the committee reviews it, we'll be posting it online, letting people comment on it, and then we will be having strategic kind of public engagement to get feedback. As I was mentioning in the beginning of this, before we get started, this is not the sexiest of projects. It's a very technical kind of thing we're doing, but the hope is that we create some predictability for staff, for people who want to invest in the community. We're looking for protection of residents and businesses, and just, again, not trying to be overly regulatory, but make things a lot easier to invest in this city. So tonight, we're here to talk about what we call the code audit. And again, it's the blueprint. If you all had a chance to read the document, there's three parts to it. The major things of improvement, which is what I'm going to focus on tonight. A chapter-by-chapter analysis of the existing regulations. So we obviously have to do that to know where we need to fix things. So that kind of talks about areas where you're missing something, or that, current sections of the language, like condominiums, where that's not really necessary to have that type of language, but we can look at other things like that. And then a proposed outline, because one of the things we talked about doing is a comprehensive reorganization and reformatting of the code, to make it easier for the average person to pick up the ordinance and know, hey, I want to build a swimming pool. What do I have to do? Do I have to get a permit? Where can it be? That's how residents use it. Accessory uses are a big residential thing. Or if a developer comes in, what can I do? What kind of housing development can I do? What kind of commercial development can I do? And giving tools to the city to help in these regulatory times. The public input, I think we talked about, will be throughout. And it's going to be, a little bit strategic, obviously. But we will be making sure to be as transparent as possible. All of these meetings, it looks like, will be on YouTube. We will be posting drafts as we go along so that you can kind of stay up to date on things. With that, I'm gonna take a little break and just see if there's any questions on the process, and then we'll get to the fun stuff. Yeah.
Where do we find the document?
Is there a page?
Available online,
Yeah, it's usually on the,
We'll have it on the city's website.
but not yet.
Not yet.
okay.
Yep.
So this is not the whole summary. This is actually, I gave this presentation to the smaller set of boards last week. So this is just a refresh. You've all seen this, so you can take a little nap here. This is the information as gathered last Wednesday, and I will be updating it and closing the survey and kind of putting summaries to all the questions. But I just thought people might be interested to see some of the things that we're seeing from the questions we asked. So one of the first questions we asked is, have you had any interactions with the zoning? And if you have, what are some of the things we need to learn from this? No shock to me that the predominant number of people have never had an issue. Yes?
Sorry, maybe you said this, but how many respondents were there?
So as of last Wednesday, a total of 116 people had responded. And some of the other questions I've listed, because you can obviously skip questions, you'll see the numbers, but as of last Wednesday, 116. This is not, we don't use the survey as the end-all to be-all of the direction. It's just one opportunity to get some very specific feedback. And again, I will summarize this in a report that can also be posted. I don't have all of the questions on this presentation. I just thought you might be interested to see some of the answers. The folks that, said, yeah, we've had things, we saw some fairly common concerns. There was discussions about, how do we allow for homeless shelters? There was questions about dilapidated homes and some of those issues. We had questions, I think there was one question about commercial backing up to residential and the visibility of that type of thing. So a lot of different range of things that came up as ideas that we need to consider moving forward. And then we asked a lot about, you know, because there's a whole bunch of new housing products that are online, and just trying to get a feel for what type of housing people felt might be appropriate in New Philadelphia. Now, I mean, we could ask 800 questions and say, is this appropriate in downtown? Is this appropriate in this area or this neighborhood? We didn't get that far in detail. So we kind of have to read into this a little bit. So for example, one of the questions we asked about was like cottage courts and having smaller homes that kind of encircle a small, courtyard or something, and would have access to parking and all that type of thing. And you could see of 150 people who responded to this question, the predominant answer was 6, which is just somewhat above, somewhat appropriate. When I look at that, I think probably the response is it could be appropriate in New Philadelphia in certain areas. So not necessarily, a 10 out of 10, we want to see this everywhere. But certainly it's something that we will want to look into as to how this could be accommodated. We talked about new single-family construction, similar in density and similar in kind of, makeup in neighborhoods as your kind of current core neighborhoods. 8 out of 10 here, so far more than, somewhat appropriate. This is probably the highest ranking one that people really like the current densities. Again, new housing products we're seeing out, these small kind of apartment houses look like a big single family home, but have, 4 or 6 units in them. Again, kind of halfway in, somewhat appropriate. Townhomes and row houses at, roughly 8 to 12 units per acre. These are what I tried to do was reflect the densities that are in these photos. And again, we were seeing responsive, middle of the road responses. Apartment buildings, which everybody's familiar with, again, 5. And then urban density housing that might be located, we talked about with the board some possibility for more urban housing, more compact development near downtown to get more people in the area. And again, this was somewhat appropriate. And then apartments as part of mixed-use buildings. Again, this got a little bit stronger support than some of the other housing types. And then finally, we threw in, this is becoming also more popular, the accessory dwelling units, where you have either attached or detached, a secondary dwelling unit that may be used for family. Some people rent them out. This got some general support, but one of the things we do, one of the things that has come up in meetings and in the survey was questions about, what is a family per se when you talk about a single family home? Or what is a housekeeping unit? That is one of the things we're going to be looking at, because there are certain occupancies that can trigger other reviews, like fire and building code. So we have to be careful that we're balancing this all with trying to be fair and equal to everybody and accommodating to all types of housing choice, but also meeting the fire and building code requirements depending on how we allow this. So that is something we'll be carefully looking at. One of the other questions that came up was about the downtown. You do have a downtown design review committee right now, and we're not saying that that should go away, but one of the questions was, should we kind of take this up another notch? Not a lot, not maybe necessarily going into full-blown historic review, but the answer was predominantly, yeah, we'd like to see a little bit more elevated design. I'll talk about later in the reformatting, but one of the ideas is moving that design review and those standards within the planning and zoning code, and actually just helping out by putting in more graphics about, when we say we want this, this is kind of what we're thinking about. We talked about questions of like the current design standards, and I know this one might be hard to see, but the top one is that the current design requirements, landscaping, signage, building design, that the way that new buildings have gone in the city is fine. We're okay with this. The blue line, the next one down, is the city should focus more on adding landscaping with some minor building design, the kind of middle ground. The next one down is the city should focus on creating stronger design standards for new building and improve the standards. And in that case, you can see there's kind of split between, a little bit more and a lot more. So I think that's one where we'll be looking for better guidance as we move through with the boards. So again, that's only about half of the survey questions. Probably next week, I'm going to close the survey and then summarize all the comments that we got. and put in like all of the questions, put them in there. What we'll do is we'll send that summary to anybody who put their email in the survey, so that if you participated, you're gonna get a copy of that results, and then we'll see, about getting it posted to the website. And again, we use this as general guidance moving forward. It's just one kind of opportunity to get some input. So now I want to talk about the thing we're here to talk about, which is where are we all heading with this? So the major themes really kind of focus around 4 major structural changes with the current ordinance. So the first one is just reorganize it and reformat it to make it make more sense. Lots more graphics. You have 0 graphics, and that can go a long way in how things are defined. When you say, what's the maximum height of a building, show me how it's measured. So we will be doing all of this. We will be consolidating information into chapters that have related regulations. Accessory uses, like I said, that's the most predominant chapter that residents on average use. They can go to one chapter and find out how they can do all their different accessory uses, sheds, garages, like I said, swimming pools, family daycare homes, all of those things that are traditional, home occupations. So we'll be making it easier to find things in this ordinance. We're gonna be consolidating, so right now, the way that the codified ordinances breaks things down every community pretty much has done this in history. During the 1980s, this is the way you did it. It's 3 titles. The first title is a whopping 1 paragraph. The second title is a little bit longer with subdivisions. I think it's 3 pages, and then everything else falls under zoning. There's no reason to have those titles, so we will be getting rid of that and just focusing on chapters. We will also be looking to move the downtown design standards and the wind energy system standards that are currently found in the building code into the zoning code, because the regulations that go along with them are more related to zoning than the actual structural building element. They talk about where they're allowed and what types are allowed. That's something that should be consolidated into zoning. So we'll be looking to make that all fit together. We'll be trimming it down where we can with things like trying to get rid of the long list of what you have to submit to get a conditional use review. Those are checklists that can go to the applications. And so again, this is usually the one that everybody can buy into. This is the one that, oh my gosh, this would be so helpful. There's nothing, controversial about this. And that's when we move on to the next theme. And we start talking about the real change. So the next kind of theme of change is the review procedures. How does the city evaluate things coming to them? Is it administrative and it only goes through staff? Do you even have to come in and get a permit? Or do you have to get something a little bit more higher level review? So this is where we start to see the age of the current code. There's a lot of pieces that are missing, but there's also a lot of modern techniques out there that the city could benefit from. So one, we'll be consolidating all of the review procedures into one chapter. So you want to know how to get a conditional use, you go here, a step-by-step process, each with their own review criteria, so it'll be more predictable about what each board will be looking at when making a decision. We have suggested establishing a code administrator. So right now, it actually says the public service director is in charge of it all. But what we have found is, while that's a very important role, you're usually not the one doing this. And so we like to establish who's in charge of it, kind of unrelated to any other formal job title, so that depending on, who your staffing is at any one time, you can pick the right person to oversee the zoning code. So it might be the public service director. It might be, somebody else that you hire on. It makes it for a cleaner administration and enforcement. One of the things that came out of the meeting with the boards last week was adding a certificate of zoning compliance, a zoning permit, some type of administrative permit that is something that the city can use when you might not have to get a building permit, but we certainly want to know what's going on. Particularly when it comes to changes of uses. Somebody goes from a restaurant to an office building or vice versa. You want to know that. Taxes, building code issues, and just having a general idea of what's going on. This gives a kind of a good threshold for the city to start tracking significant changes in businesses and development. It also helps them say, hey, you know, did you know you need a sign permit to get that new sign? So that is one administrative point we're gonna put in there. Right now, most things are reviewed as part of the building permit. So if, you know, this gives us something that if it doesn't rise to the level of needing a true building permit review, there's still a checkpoint. One of the things we've also suggested is what we call administrative waivers. And this would be essentially a small variance that staff could approve. Now, we are going to narrowly tailor this to a very limited percentage, probably about 10%, and only limit the types of things people can ask these waivers for. The hope is that this helps with people who do have, like, let's take an average resident who happens to have a lot that is not precisely rectangular. You know, it got clipped by a road at some point in time, and their building is going to just kind of cross into the setback requirement by 6 inches on a 10-foot setback. But because of this weird situation, they really need a variance. Well, right now they have to go to the Board of Appeals to get that, which costs money. This allows for very, very small variances. They have to be the same standards. There's some kind of unusual circumstance, but staff can approve them as part of the permit process. So it makes it easier, particularly for residents, to do things, investment and stuff, without having to go to the board for everything. Again, we're gonna narrowly scope this, so it's not gonna be for everything. You know, businesses are not gonna be able to come and say, hey, I just want 10 more square feet of sign area. Come on, it's great, right? We're gonna limit where you can ask for this. You know, they can always go up to the Board of Appeals. But again, we're trying to find ways to make things easier, particularly for residents.
Hey Wendy,
Yes.
would you let them know about, because Tom's on the Board of Zoning Appeals, even with that 6 inches, they have to, it just isn't gonna be, you can automatically go within that. There's still gonna be criteria, just be, you know, would you go over that a little more? 'Cause
Yeah.
Tom, you know.
So it's the same, they have to meet the same criteria for a variance. There has to be a practical difficulty, topography. Like I said, a lot, you know, I've seen it a lot when, for example, the lot was originally square, but then a road got added or expanded and clipped they clipped the right of way, and now all of a sudden they have this unusually shaped lot that doesn't make sense with the house, and they wanna, you know, do some investment and stuff. So it's not you ask for it, you get it. You have to meet the same criteria. And actually, one of the things we usually say is, you know, the administrator still maintains the ability to send it up to the Board of Zoning Appeals. So if there's a thing where I'm like, yeah, that's on the line, they will also have the ability to send it up. So again, it's one thing we're hoping to do as part of this update is where something really should be allowed. Like if you are approving a lot of variances for something, we probably should allow it. So hopefully we're reducing the workload already on the Board of Appeals. This would be keeping like minor, very small things out of the Board of Appeals. Now you're still, I guarantee you're still gonna see work, but yeah, the same criteria apply to these administrative waivers as it does for a full-blown variance.
Thanks.
And again, I think we had talked about like probably 10% and probably going to apply to like setbacks only, maybe building height or, you know, something like that, but a very limited scope of what can be asked for. The other thing we're gonna suggest is what we call alternative equivalency review. This is what I had said is kind of something to think about as a positive variance. So when people ask for a variance, they want to lower a standard. They want to go below what is required. This allows somebody to say, you know what? I know what you're trying to get at with your buffering requirement. I have a great idea that I think would be better than what you're asking for, but the code doesn't specifically allow it. This would allow that kind of application to go in front of either the Planning Commission or for downtown design standards, it could go in front of the Downtown Design Review Board. A board-level review where they could, on a case-by-case basis, somebody could say, here's what I'm proposing, here's how it meets or exceeds your standard, can I do it? So they don't have the practical difficulty or the unnecessary hardship, but they're also not trying to reduce the standard. I use this picture. I don't know how they got this, but this is a good picture to show you an example of this. If this fencing, this kind of architectural fencing and art kind of fencing, if you are requiring buffering between, say, a parking lot and a street, that typically most codes would say you have to have like a fence and maybe a little bit of greenery. Well, what if somebody said we have a great public art project that we think could go there and be the same level of screening? Technically, if you had in your code that said no, you can only do like fencing and stuff, there's a variance, but what's the hardship? You know, so this would allow for a little bit of creativity. Again, this is not something that would be administratively approved. It has to be reviewed by a board on a case-by-case basis. But it gives at least one avenue of some flexibility. I've had a number of communities that have had this in place. It's not highly used, but it is a tool that's out there. I have seen it beneficial, particularly to like downtown and historic reviews, particularly with things like materials, because the technology behind materials has changed so much in recent history that, you know, some communities say, oh, you can't have vinyl. Well, all right, you can't have vinyl, but what about this new composite material or something like that? So I don't think it's one that's gonna be on the books a lot, but it is kind of, again, a tool of flexibility. Formalizing the subdivision regulations. So I told you the Title III was the subdivision regulations. It's like 3 pages. The good news is most of the technical standards the city has for public improvements and stuff, you have in your construction drawings. I took a look at them. That's fine. Those are technical standards that really should be outside of the code. But the one thing that you don't have is the actual procedure by which a person goes through to get a subdivision. And that is, I think, a key piece that's missing. So one of the things we will be doing, you still can get, obviously people are subdividing, you're going through a process, but we will be spelling that out. And there's usually 2 forms of subdivisions: a minor subdivision, which is basically a lot split, or up to, you know, you're creating up to 4 new lots with no roads, no infrastructure, or you're replatting, you're consolidating lots or something like that. That's administratively approved. Anything over 5 lots or that has public infrastructure has to go through a major subdivision review, largely reviewed by Planning Commission. That's what most communities do. And then ultimately it goes to council, who is responsible for accepting the public dedication of improvements. That piece is in your current regulations, so you do have that last piece. But part of this is just giving people a clear idea of what is the process, what are you looking for, and how, you know, where are these pieces that we have to look at, that the construction drawings are, you know, adopted outside of the code, and you will find them here. So again, this is something, a big piece that you're missing now that we will put into place. The last 2 are the minor pieces. Transitional regulations. No matter what we do, this is going to be a big change. Transitional regulations are a small piece of language we will put in there at the beginning, the very first chapter, that says, if you have applied for any type of permit, any type of review, the day, a month, whatever it is before this new code goes in effect, here's how we deal with that. And here's how we deal with it is traditionally, we will let you go under the current code unless you opt into the new code. But then after the effective date of the code, if you apply the day after this goes in effect, you're going by the new code. So it helps for people who have something in the process now to understand what their next steps are. We're not just abandoning them, but we're also not saying, stop, you have to fit the new code. We're looking into their vested rights. The other part, the complete application requirements, is beneficial to the boards. This requires that when you go and apply for something, you provide all the information that's needed for a board to make a decision. You're not saying, hang on, you know what, I'll get them the landscaping plan the day of the meeting. Well, that doesn't give the Planning Commission or anybody a chance to review it. So this would give a process by which, before any timelines start, staff has 2 or 3 days to make sure that you have submitted everything that needs to be reviewed. So every board should have the materials they need to make the decisions. Again, it's a very simple piece, It prevents people from doing what we call designing at the podium, which is getting up and trying to negotiate a last minute deal with the boards, and the boards are like, what are you talking about? We don't see this, so. Any questions about the procedures? Those are big changes here. No? All right. Because next we're gonna start talking about the zoning districts and the uses. You can see on the back there, there's only a handful of zoning districts. That's not a bad thing, but one of the things we've picked up on as we've had discussions here is maybe you could benefit from a few. You have one residential zoning district. It's been a long time since I've come across a community that has one residential zoning district. So one of the things, you know, I took a look at is like, what are some of the changes we might look at the district structure? And this is not formalized. This is kind of a preliminary, we're gonna start with this. As we work through the draft, we may end up adding or refining these, but this is kind of the general direction we're looking at. So right now, we're looking at possibly going through to at least 3 zoning districts, residential zoning districts. R1, which would be, you know, more of your traditional suburban, single-family zoning, you know, kind of residential developments. The R2 Central Residential District is your older neighborhoods where you have a little bit more of single-family, two-family, which is allowed right now in your R. It's gonna look a little bit like your current R district. And it's gonna have the current densities that you see, you know, just in the neighborhoods right outside of downtown. And then an R3 district that will have attached residential. As we get into more discussions and drafting it, that's when we'll start talking about like what is the maximum densities we wanna be looking at this. But that's just kind of the starting point of what we're thinking about with residential. What is called the Trailer Park District now will be changed to the Manufactured Home Park District. And we will be maintaining that to protect the manufactured home parks. They will be allowed to continue as they are. We don't want to grandfather them and, you know, make it a very complicated situation. Since the 1980s, there's been a lot of changes. A lot of people aren't doing the kind of parks like you can envision them now. We will be allowing for permanently sited manufactured homes just on any lot like you can with a single family home. It's a state law. So we're gonna be making sure that manufactured homes are allowed in more than just the mobile home park. The office district, we're suggesting changing that to the office transitional district because the way it's written now, right outside of downtown here, is a very transitional. It's a little bit residential. It's a little bit low intensity office uses, you know, allowing that type of transitional district. And it might be more appropriate in other areas of the city as we talk about it. Obviously keeping the central business district, and your current business district will be the regional business district. Industrial district, keeping that as well. We're also suggesting the addition of 2 new districts. One is the public institutional district. This is something that is good for your the college campus, the airport, the school campuses, any large kind of institutional use. It kind of helps protect those uses. It identifies them on the zoning map, so you know, okay, why is why is the airport all residential right now? That kind of thing. You will see it's public institutional. It can also be very beneficial, particularly for things like the college campus. Because they're allowed to, if you've designated the area that will be public institutional, it makes them easier for them to expand within their own zoning district without without as much kind of red tape to do that. So, again, this is something that, churches, if they want to be in it, they can, but churches are going to be allowed in most of the districts. So we're not saying you have to be, this is not just the only place public and institutional uses can go. It's just ideal for some of the larger campuses and some of the larger public uses you have, big parks, that type of thing. And then the final one is a planned development district. And this is a tool, and the mayor and I were talking more about this before this meeting. You don't have, but a lot of communities have. A lot of communities use these, and you'll see a lot of their subdivisions develop through it. That's okay. The way I think this will be written is more to encourage mixed-use developments. So there's been a couple places we've talked about where, especially near downtown, it would be good to get a little bit more density, have some mixed-use buildings with commercial and residential, have a mixture of, recreational stuff and paths and have it all connected. You don't have a zoning district that would accommodate that now. The plan development is a tool that would allow the city to evaluate a project on a project basis. And what they would do is the applicant would come in for a zone change, and as part of that, have a development plan. Say, we want to do this big mixed-use kind of development. The planning commission and council would evaluate that, that development plan and say, yeah, that looks great. Make some changes, make some recommendations, and once they approve it, then the development can go through the permitting. But that development plan is tied to that. If somebody wants to do something different, they have to come in and get a zone change. So it's a good way to accommodate some flexibility for development that may not fall strictly within the scope of one of these other zoning districts. I will say, it is not designed to be spot zoning where you have one little corner of like an intersection that you want to try to do something tricky and circumvent what we're doing in the zoning code. That's not what this is for. This is for larger scale developments, and we will probably have a minimum acreage or a minimum density that will trigger that you can use this tool. So this is not meant to be just scattershot all over the city. It will be for larger comprehensive developments. Related to the districts are going to be the uses, and this is where we're going to start looking at how we look at uses. Some of this is going to be looking at, should we go a little bit more form-based? And form-based is like a newer approach to zoning, where it's less about the use itself and more about the appearance and the context, the form. Is it, how tall is it? Does it resemble the large single-family home? And so in the list of uses, we might have something that says townhomes and row houses because that form of development is the preferred form of development over apartment buildings. So that gives a little bit more predictability in the types of housing that could be in each of the districts. Again, we talked about the multifamily district, and also previously talked about having to clarify what does a single family mean, what does a housekeeping unit mean, trying to be legal and fair to everyone. And then more importantly, I think we will be looking at use tables. So right now, each of the districts are in their own separate chapters with a laundry list of what uses you're allowed to do. This is the modern way to do it, in a use table. All the zoning districts are across the top. All the uses are listed on the left-hand column. You can look across the entire district structure in the city and know where are housing allowed, where is a retail business allowed. All the uses are defined, so we're not trying to say, oh, you can have a bookstore and a florist shop here. Those are all retail. So we will kind of classify things into broader uses with clearer definitions. Right now, conditional uses, which is a tool, again, that the city has in place already, is largely used in the residential district. So conditional use is where you go and say, there are certain uses that might be appropriate in this district, but it really depends on the site location. Is it on Collector Street? There's a compatibility element. So it's almost like it could be, but let us take one look at it. You only use that in the residential districts now. This is a tool that could be very useful in other districts. One of the examples I've given that I've seen more recently is industrial uses in downtown, and everybody goes, what? What are you talking about? There are a lot of artisans who do industrial kind of processes, welding and type of stuff, where they're primarily retail up front, but they're doing things that you might classify as like assembly and stuff like that. So there are certain things that you're like, well, let us look at what that use is. It's one review. So I think there's more use for that on things that I think could be more giving in certain districts if you had this tool. Adding in more housing options and looking, again, this is going to be one I think where I've always said, we'll spend a solid meeting just talking about principal uses. What are we missing? And you are missing a lot of uses we're going to have to look at. Solar and all these things we'll have to look at. The same thing's going to be done with accessory uses and temporary uses. You allow for accessory buildings, but that's all you say. We allow them. There's nothing that says how tall they can be, how big they can be. You are limited by lot coverage, you do have that. There's nothing that says, oh, your accessory building should probably be smaller than your principal building, you know, because it's accessory. So there's some things we're gonna look at to try to kind of clean up some regulations and give some guidance. Again, we're not trying to over-regulate, but just make things work. We certainly don't wanna make things non-conforming. You know, we don't wanna make it more difficult to invest, but it's definitely something we're gonna look at. This is also an area where I think there's a lot of good opportunity for modernization, addressing things like outdoor dining, clothing and drop boxes, solar panels and arrays, not just the principal use, but when it's, somebody has a solar array out back of their house for their own personal use. And accessory dwelling units. A lot of these things we'll be talking about a lot more. We've also had some conversations about short-term rentals and kind of what are some of the potential regulations, if any, that we want to look at. Are there certain neighborhoods that might need to be, you know, protected or at least considered? Currently, there's at least the state bill is still out there, but I think it's kind of dead in its tracks at this point. It's been May since I've seen any movement. There was a state bill in play that was looking to strip cities' control over short-term rentals. As of today, you still can regulate them. So part of that will be getting into discussion about what are the concerns and, you know, can we address those concerns in zoning, or are they better addressed somewhere else? So this is the district and uses. I'm gonna move on to like I'll call it the pretty picture stuff next. So let me pause. It's a lot of information I just put out there. Any questions on this? Yes,
It's not a question, but that sample chart you have,
yeah.
can you make some hard copies of those and put those in the council's mailboxes for us?
I think we can, yeah. I mean, and certainly one of the things that, you know, I like to do also in practice, I won't have a time to do this here in the short order, but when we get to that discussion, is I usually try to take your current list of uses and put them in a use table. So that you have something to work off of, this is what we do now. We may not have recognized it because we don't go and look at everything together versus this is what we look at. But yeah, I'm happy to send like a full use table from another community for you to take a look at how it does, yeah.
And then, one more question. You talked about earlier, about having a small group that reviews. What does that group look like? Is that something you're selecting, or is that something the administration will be selecting?
I don't want to speak.
Administration.
Do you know what
Plan
your,
commission.
will there be anybody from council on that
Sure,
committee?
yeah,
Okay.
Cheryl's on
yeah,
it, right?
Cheryl's,
I'm on it.
Cheryl's on it.
Okay.
yeah.
If there could be two,
But, yeah,
if there could be two council members on there, if you could,
Oh, yeah,
Mayor,
yeah,
that's, you
yeah,
know,
definitely.
just so they, if somebody else would like to
Right,
ask one.
and you're always
we-
welcome to attend them.
I know, but if there could be somebody on, just on the review board with
Sure.
them, I'm not asking to be on the review board, just, let's be very clear about this. But if I have a question, I could ask one of the other
Yeah.
council
It
members.
would, and then it would come to council
Right.
anyways.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, throughout the
There's
whole
like
process.
this
it'll
long
be brought to
process.
council, yeah.
Yeah, that's all,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Mayor.
Have you worked with cities that have special zoning considerations in areas where most of the homes are 150 years old of a certain style? There's an empty lot and somebody throws a double wide on that lot in amongst these beautiful historic homes. Is it legal to dictate how a home is built in a certain area, I guess is the question.
The answer is yes, you can.
I mean, if there's an empty lot across from my house, if those folks ever decide to split it off and sell it, I'd like to see something built in the style of every other house that's on the street, not some big sore thumb sticking out.
So there's, yeah, absolutely, there's ways to do that. There's kind of primarily, I would say, two ways I've seen the majority of communities do it. I mean, there's always variations of it. The one is historic review. I mean, and I'm talking a historic district, certificates of appropriateness, you are getting into architectural styles and everything like that. That's one, and that's probably the more extreme version of it. The other one is, and actually I, you know, I'm working in Logan, West Virginia, and they don't even have zoning now. We're creating one for them. And they have a similar situation. They don't have a lot of them. We are doing a housing overlay district, and I would call it historic preservation light, where we are requiring that any housing go in there meet certain compatibility standards. So not necessarily architectural style, although you could, But that, you know, if the predominant buildings are 2 stories high, that any new building should be 2 stories high. If, you know, if it's prominent, like, if there is like a predominant appearance or character, not just the architectural style, you could require that, the same massing, the same setbacks and stuff like that. So it kind of, I will say this, especially when we start talking about like signs and landscaping, I always explain things that if you think about the whole pendulum of regulations, there's doing nothing, you just don't regulate something, to, I mean, regulating the coloring of awnings, and there are communities that will regulate the color of an awning, right? So the question is, where are you in that spectrum? And it may vary on signs versus landscaping versus, you know, the housing compatibility. So yeah, that is, I just actually made a note of that, that there's certainly some tools out there that, you know, again, you may not want to go to full-blown historic preservation review, but there's tools that can accomplish a lot of the same things.
One more thing, I'm president of Tuscarawas County Heritage Home Association. I have been for 10 or 12 years, and, you know, we promote preservation. We do everything we can to make people aware of, you know, the beauty and enjoyment of owning an older century-old home. So I'd like to encourage the mayor and council to get some wording in this document that kind of protects our neighborhoods. When and if the schools ever pass a levy and we go to a giant campus somewhere else, that's gonna leave a lot of vacant land in our city, and that's another concern. What is gonna get built on that land? What are those houses gonna look like? Some of them are close to historic neighborhoods, some aren't, but, while I had your attention, I thought I'd throw that in there too. But, you know, keep the historic districts areas. You go out Broadway, you go East High, Fair Avenue, that's where I live, so I'm partial to that. But there's some beautiful homes there, and to have a house that's just not contiguous in style, it doesn't look
It
very
affects,
nice.
yeah, it affects.
So I think you get what I mean. I just hope that some of that ends up in this new document.
So that's actually a really good example of how this document, this recommendation, is kind of is a fluid document. It's kind of, this is the direction we're heading in, but certainly what we end up is probably going to vary a little bit. And that's a good example of where we ultimately may say, as we're in the process, and I get, you know, we work on the zoning district, I say, you know what, from what you're talking about, I think an overlay district would be appropriate. Because an overlay district, which you don't have any of right now, but there are, the current language, the current districts you have now is what we would call base zoning districts. Every piece of land in the city has a base zoning district. An overlay district is something where you have very unique requirements that will only apply to a limited, you know, portion of that. So it's kind of like a second layer of zoning. So in the case of this, there may be, let's say there's 5 neighborhoods we could identify that really need some kind of level of historic preservation light, right? We create an overlay district that keeps them the R, whatever R district they're gonna be, but then says, in addition to that, we have these other rules. So that may be something that could come out of, as we work through this, that wasn't in this report, but that's not necessarily a bad thing.
And in most of those cases, those areas are highly recognizable.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I could almost probably point, you know, anybody in the city, I could be, you show me where it is, and they would like draw the outline for the overlay district for me. The other place, you know, another example where overlay districts can be beneficial is like, you know, if you have a commercial corridor that has different zoning districts, but you wanna have one set of design requirements for it. You don't necessarily wanna change the zoning and the uses, but you could apply a universal set of standards on it, so that overlay district is another kind of opportunity for that. Yes?
Wendy, for nonprofits, I see there's like 3 business districts, the neighborhood, the central, the regional, and what you're proposing. Is there one where they're more preferred to go into, or are they all kind of equal in this proposal?
So the nonprofits, it kind of depends on the actual use. I mean, there's nonprofits that are just office space, and an office could go in pretty much any commercial district. You know, there are, you know, we had talked about homeless shelters and stuff like that. That's gonna be some, you know, could be different things. There are service providers that they might be appropriate in the office, you know, and stuff like that. So it's not so much that they're public, nonprofit, or private. It's really what is the land use of it and how does that fit into the context of the districts? Yeah. So that's when you'll see, like in, again, we can post a bigger version of the use table. I tend not to get into, saying, oh, public schools, you get preferential treatment over private schools. An elementary school is an elementary school. And the same kind of thing is, we look at housing, what's the density and that type of thing. And then, like I promised, this is the last theme, but this is the pretty picture stuff. This is the design aspect of it. And you do have some, I think I said this to the committee, you have some very confusing sign regulations, we'll have to fix that. You have some basic landscaping and buffering requirements, which are primarily about when a commercial district and commercial development goes up next to a residential, like how do we soften that change in use? Parking and access, big one we're gonna talk about. I heard that you were working on a trails plan. Is there a way we can work in trails, maybe in new subdivisions? If there's a plan for trail connection, you're gonna have to include that in your new subdivision. So there's ways we can look at that. Signs, again, a little bit of confusion. We'll have to work through that. There's also a legal element of signs we're gonna have to get to. There's been a lot of Supreme Court cases in recent years dealing with signs and how cities as a government can regulate speech. So we will be carefully updating it to make sure that you're as close to in line with law as we can get you and protect you. These are the ones you have now, and it just need some improvements. The downtown design standards I said we would roll in. Again, we'll look at how we enhance those. But I think there's also some new standards you can look at. Infill compatibility is one of the ones. Now, the pictures I'm showing are for like a downtown infill compatibility, but a similar premise can be used for, like we were talking about earlier, the historic kind of overlay districts. Architectural standards for new commercial development, what keeps somebody from just putting up a cinder block Dollar General versus, putting a little bit effort in the design. Green infrastructure in subdivisions. As long as they have some best management practices, why not allow for them to have bioswales and more natural stormwater accommodation than concrete? So looking at some of those options. And then we talked about building in flexibility. The worst thing we can do is say, nope, we have exactly one standard, and that is the standard you will meet. There is no way to do anything unless you prove that hardship. There's a lot of ways we can build in some flexibility. Landscaping and buffering. Buffer between a commercial and a residential. You could have a very wide buffer with a lot of vegetation. You could have a narrower buffer with maybe a wall and a little bit of vegetation. So giving some ways to pick and choose options. We talked about the administrative waivers as a way to propose something new and innovative. Urban versus suburban. You have both types of commercial developments, both types of residential developments. They garner different rules. Buffering between a downtown, like a parking lot or parking garage down here, is gonna be a lot different than, further out. And then again, looking at things like the intensity of use. Obviously, a more intense use next to residential is gonna warrant a little bit more better treatment than, a low intensity office use next to a residential. So those are the kinds of, again, I call them pretty picture elements of the code that we'll be looking at. As I mentioned, it's all about the spectrum of how much do you want to require. I haven't heard anything that, again, I haven't heard that we want to regulate the color of an awning, but I have heard that, we do have a little bit of an expectation of particularly with regards to newer commercial development. So those will be things as we get through and kind of refine it, we'll talk about, is this gonna work? Should we do a little bit more? Should we back it off a little bit? And that's where the importance of this committee will come in, is they're gonna be the first line of defense about what should the city move forward with. So with that, we're at the question standpoint. I know I've been answering questions throughout, but this is where you can, anything you forgot or anything new, you can ask me. Yes?
Is there a time frame for when you want this finalized and implemented, or when it's expected to be?
Yeah, so we are, these tend to take about a year-long process. We did start towards the end of the year, but it really got rolling this year. So I would anticipate, provided we don't run into any hiccups with, unfortunately, COVID put a stop to things, I know, for a while, but, provided we can keep scheduling meetings and stuff, I would expect that by the end of the year, we're moving into adoption, if not, already in the process. And again, the way we kind of do this is, I don't run away and like write the entire code in its entirety and then drop that in the committee's lap. Yeah, they would fire me on the spot. No, what I do is I usually write a group of chapters that are kind of related. So the first round is usually the review procedure. So you get a handle on like, how are you gonna be evaluating this stuff? How does a conditional use process go? And then we kind of go through that. I make revisions, and then that's what would be posted as, okay, the committee's reviewed this, this is what we think we're moving forward with. And then we focus on the land use as principal and accessory. And then we focus on, the design standards. So that, to some degree, there's like a little bit of wait and see. Yeah, no, we're gonna get to the parking. I know parking's an issue, but we're gonna get to that. But at the same time, you're not trying to process 150 or so pages of regulations. We kind of work through it. And then as we go through there, we have strategic updates for the public. We, get the feedback, we'll allow comments and everything like that. Before we move into the adoption process, we have a big public meeting as well. So it's not tied to any hearings. It's just hey, we have it all together. Here's what we're moving forward with. Any last comments and revisions? So what I work for is that when we get to the adoption process, it's smooth sailing. We don't have any hiccups where there's anybody that, that we can't please 100% of people 100% of the time, but for the most part, we've listened to concerns, we've addressed them, or we have a reason why we changed something or, went in a certain direction, and that we can address those as we go along.
Anything else?
Oh, yes.
Yes, you mentioned that part of the process is going to be clarifying definitions within the code.
Mhm.
And also, I would say to eliminate any arbitrary language that could be misinterpreted by certain people. What sort of process are you going to use in order to update those definitions? What kind of outside consultation and sources will you be pulling from?
So there's the definitions are just part of the process. And like I said, every use is defined. We have a process by which there's like similar use determination. So you might come in with something new that there's a way to figure out how it's permitted. The one thing I will say is there's probably a handful of pages of definitions now. Most of the codes I write end up with 30 to 40 pages of definitions. So every use, every term that, isn't reasonable enough to pick up a Webster dictionary and define, this is how the city of New Philadelphia defines it. As far as sources go, it kind of depends. I mean, I have my own collection of definitions I've picked up over the years in my own research. Sign definitions, signs are one of my specialty. I have a million definitions of signs. But there's also a lot of sources out there for communities, like the professional organization I'm a member of, American Planning Association, has literally a zoning dictionary. So we pull from a variety of different resources, and a lot of it is part of my work as we go through here is research. I mean, while we aren't trying to reinvent the wheel, there's always new things we're doing in every community that I'm like, wait, let's see how this works, let's see how it's defined. And some of it is also sourced from the state. Medical marijuana, there is a very particular definition we have to go through by the state. Residential facilities, which are defined as group homes, that the state says you have to allow these type of residential facilities and these type of zoning districts, have very specific definitions. So, certain things we will pull from the state where it's a legal kind of consideration. Good question.
I just want to think, I hope this is a process, a change that's looking forward, and not just trying to solve the problems we have now, but looking forward to, and I think about younger generations that just aren't as interested in buying a big old single-family home as, maybe my generation, my parents' generation would have been. And so we need to look at, higher density residential areas, more quality of life things like parks and trails and stuff like that we can tie together in the neighborhoods.
Yeah, I think that's a valid point, and that's certainly, I think, part of the reason that the city brought on somebody from the outside. I'm speaking not from a guest, not just from the fact that you probably don't have the resources to do this in-house in an efficient manner, but also, I've been writing zoning ordinances for nearly 27 years this year. I've worked from everywhere from North Las Vegas to Portsmouth, Virginia, so I've seen what different communities do. I've seen where it works in some places and not in others. But I've also, I do a lot of keeping up with some of the trends. So, what you're saying is true. We are seeing changes in trends, and for the most part, writing these ordinances, trying to think about like, what is going to happen in the future and how's this gonna change. Part of the thing I will say, and I think I mentioned this to the committee last time, the results I saw in the survey so far on the housing is far more progressive in New Philadelphia than I've seen in some of the other communities I work with. Some of the other communities I work with, I show some of those and they'd be like, no, we don't want any of that, Seeing a 5, halfway through, to me is already saying, no, I read that as, I see that being in the city. I'm not sure where, it's not everywhere, but I see that being in the city. So, I'm already seeing, and from the discussions I've had with the city, I've seen a desire to be very progressive, to be open and embracing to ideas, not trying to make everybody jump through hoops to invest in the community. But I also certainly see, like with the quality of life comment, like I said, there are certain things that the city is trying to achieve in the future that we can hopefully use this code update to move that forward. So like I said, if the city has a trails plan or a parks plan, requirements we have for the plan development is if that's in there, one of the things we want you to do for us is put that trail in or put that park in, or if you're going to have an urban kind of density mixed use development, we'd like a little bit of developed community gathering space and open space, not a big wide, you could have a nice big wide open area, but we'd also like some improved areas. So I think a lot of that is what I'm already seeing kind of be the direction of this. And again, some of the ideas behind some of the procedures I suggested and the flexibility is being able to use these codes moving forward without having, again, 20 years, hopefully you're not comprehensive updating it because it's not working. I haven't had that happen yet. But, that you can, move forward and that this allows you the flexibility you need to think about new things as they come on board. So, yeah. All right.
Any other questions? Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you.
Okay, again, this presentation has been posted up on YouTube, streamed to YouTube. So Larry will have the link. It's already posted, right? On our Facebook page and on our website. And the information that Wendy will provide to us in PDF and hard copy form will also be posting on our website. And stay tuned for notices on when our next public meeting will be held. All right, so we get the process underway. Thanks for coming, everybody. I really appreciate it.